See, over the course of the 19th century, every independent New World nation, except maybe for like the Dominican Republic, every one of them that I can think of is going to fight a civil war over states' rights. See, you get this argument in modern American discourse over whether the Civil War was fought over states' rights or slavery. And the answer is yes, both. It's fought over both of them. Slavery was not the only states' right that they conflicted over, but it was the main one, to the point that it was the one that they wrote about in the individual state declarations of independence. Often this goes hand in hand with an argument about whether or not the states would have seceded if slavery hadn't been an issue. But when you look beyond just the US itself, you see that this conflict over federal authority is not something unique to America. Every country that went through this process, every country that tried federalism and that tried independence as a former colony had this same conflict. It's just that the specific thing that served as the flashpoint changed from country to country. In Mexico, for example, one of the main conflicts is going to have to do with separation of church and state. Mexico at the time was a highly Catholic nation. It's still majority Catholic. It's just that it's had like huge evangelical growth lately. But it was a highly Catholic nation, and that ended up causing conflicts between those who wanted the church to have more of a role in politics and those who wanted to secularize. And in countries where that's the case, it tends to end up radicalizing into a conflict between like open state atheism and Catholicism. You see a similar thing in the Orthodox world with the rise of communism. In places that had large organized churches like that were politically active, that escalated, regular religious conflict into like full-on, wars against religion. Switzerland is not a Latin American country, but it also happens to have a federal states' rights civil war in the same period. That's going to be another continuation of the endless Protestant Catholic fighting. In other countries, it's going to be more about regionalism. It's going to be more about some kind of division between different needs in different sections of the country. But the net effect of it is that Latin America, in very quick order, goes from being like 4 main superstates to being well over a dozen. So, the first Mexican Empire, for example, it owns everything down to Panama when it's initially created. Of course, it also, owned a big chunk of what's now the US, too, that we conquered from them. But all those little Central American statelets, they're going to split off as a United States of Central America. And then that republic is going to fall apart when Guatemala gets too uppity and pisses off its neighbors. Down in South America, there's the very famous Gran Colombia of Bolivar. It breaks apart into 4 different nations by the end. Peru, Bolivia ends up breaking apart into Peru and Bolivia. Argentina, well, that one actually holds together. But it faces constant civil wars. Brazil is going to face constant civil wars. All of these countries have bids for secession. But what differs from country to country is whether or not it's able to survive. And the big thing we see is that the countries that more closely resembled the United States in terms of structure, they were the ones that managed to hold together. The social structure of Mexico and Peru, Bolivia, and Gran Colombia was too different from America for federal republicanism to survive there. But down in Argentina and in their neighbor Chile and in their little neighbor Uruguay, that's not going to be the case. Brazil will ultimately go on to develop into something very much like the American South, except more extreme and with a constitutional monarch on the throne. Argentina is going to develop into something that looks very much like the American North, minus the industry. See, for a while, Argentina looked like it was going to become a Spanish United States. They had fought a war for independence like the United States. They had created a frontier republic, a republic of pioneer farmers like the United States. They had fought civil wars over states' rights, and their federal government had triumphed, like the United States. They fought many bloody wars to exterminate their horse nomads, like the United States. We had the Great Plains. They had the Pampas. They developed a cowboy culture, like the United States, except they call them gauchos. They were developing a grand, mighty navy, like our Great White Fleet. In the late 1800s, if you were an Italian, it was said, it was a flip of a coin whether you were going to go to New York City or to Buenos Aires. And they had an expression in Europe, as rich as an Argentinian, because they had so many rich cattle baron sons swaggering around Europe on their grand tour that was as much an image of opulence to them as the American robber baron was. Argentina was an extremely wealthy country, one of the richest in the world. It was a functional democracy. And although it didn't have the population that the US had, it seemed very plausible that it would develop into something like a great rival to us. A sort of counterbalance, us all the way up in the north, them all the way down in the south, sharing the New World, contesting each other for the New World. And yet, it all fell apart. And the reason Argentina ends up falling apart goes back to the issue of land. See, in America, we had a thing called the Homestead Act. Now, those of you who are American, you should be familiar with this. I do often have a few foreign students. If you didn't know, the Homestead Act was an act of President Lincoln that promised people that if they went and settled on virgin land, they could claim it as their own property. Now, a lot of states had done this with their own state land before, but not all states did. In many places, they would sell the land off. And that was the case in much of the South. Large landowners and their families were able to buy up even more land, and so they ended up owning almost everything. Had a very oligarchical society. Well, Republicans of the day, they tended to favor a great concentration in industry, but they tended to favor decentralization in agriculture. The emphasis was on the yeoman farmer, like what Thomas Jefferson wanted. That American society should be based around individual farmers who own their own land. A sort of vast agricultural petit bourgeois. And this Homestead Act made that possible, because anybody who was willing to put in the work to pioneer the land could have the land. Argentina didn't do this. In Argentina, the land ended up in the hands of the oligarchs. Those people who already had money to reinvested it in acquiring more land, which shut out newcomers, thus leading to the development of a large immigrant proletariat. They wound up with massive ranches owned by barons instead of small farms owned by families. They wound up with the starts of industrialization in their major cities along the rivers. But average Joes didn't get a share in it. And so, even though the country as a whole was becoming rich, inequality was quickly getting out of hand to a degree that was even worse than the Gilded Ages in the United States. And this led to the rise of a very virulent strain of left-wing populism, of socialism. In America, we would go through our own progressive era. And it ended up doing a lot of damage to the country, but it also did a lot of good for the country at the same time. It ultimately allowed the federal government to grow vastly more powerful, but it arguably staved off a major class war. Down in Argentina, they fail to thread that needle. They fail to strike a sort of compromise, and instead politics becomes more radicalized, and it leads to a flare-up again of civil war, coups, riots, and just general other instability. And when the socialists take power, their attempts to steer the Argentinian economy are going to backfire, impoverishing the place, and thus making the conflict over resources even more vicious. The more socialism and Peronism was kind of like people will argue till the end of time whether it should be considered socialist or fascist. It's both, kind of. Peronism ends up completely derailing Argentinian development. The nation that seemed like it would be an American rival ends up crashing hard to the point where it's now one of the most broken states in Latin America. It's still wealthier than most of the others. You remember from the map. But in terms of how far it has fallen, it has been dramatic. And if you keep up with the news at all, you know that their currency is on the verge of collapse. They've been having hyperinflation like Venezuela. Their infrastructure was on the verge of collapse. And only recently did it finally lead to a backlash back in the direction of liberalism. Argentina, in the same way that Japan is one of the most spectacular success stories in world history, of a country that willfully transforms itself in a single generation into a modern nation, and then manages to rise from the ashes again after getting destroyed. Argentina is one of the most spectacular tragedies of modern history. A country that was set on the right path, that was developing into something very nice, until it, due to easily avoidable bad policies, spiraled out of control into something ugly.